All right, good afternoon to everybody. Last week we looked at how different ways of Buddhist research, and then we looked at how Buddhist studies could be done philosophically, and then we looked at several different interpretations of ideas of what to do, how to do Buddhist philosophically. And then today what I'm going to do is to show you 3 ways of studying Buddhism philosophically. We will look at these 3 ways and then see how Buddhist studies can be done basically philosophically. Now when I say this, usually in the academic circles, when we study Buddhist studies in general, there are several major streams of studies, so to say. Like Buddhist studies can be done Buddhist textual studies, and then Buddhist cultural studies, and Buddhist philosophical studies. Now these are basically the broad areas. When we say Buddhist textual studies, we are basically focusing on text, reading text and understanding text. Now textual studies, as we discussed earlier, serves as the basis of all the other studies. So textual studies in that sense are pretty fundamental. Apart from textual studies, in the academic institutions, we do Buddhist studies by studying Buddhist culture. Now Buddhist culture means Buddhist art, Buddhist archaeology, Buddhist history, and that sort of area. And then we also do what is called Buddhist philosophy. When we say Buddhist philosophy, we are studying Buddhism, the more doctrinally, and then according to the philosophical themes. So these are basically how we do Buddhist studies in academic institutes. Now, when we say studying Buddhism philosophically, it could mean several things. Now, number one, what I put is asking questions, examining and analyzing, investigation, and looking for consistency, coherence and logicality. Now when I say this, this is one way of doing Buddhist studies philosophically. However, when I list these things, you can see that these are nothing specifically philosophy or anything. These are the things we usually do in any study. Okay? Any good study, these are the things we do. But then, of course, these things have been analyzed deeply in Western philosophy. But then, what about the Buddhist philosophy? Buddhist philosophy also, we can see that these things have been analyzed deeply. So when I discuss these matters, in fact, I am not telling you anything new. Okay? These are we can get from basically from the field of Buddhist studies also. Now, if you look at these first few things, asking questions, examining, analyzing, investigating. Now, these 4 things come in questions. Examination, analysis, investigation. Now, these are common to any type of study we do. Particularly when we talk about number one, question. This asking question is something very important in academic study. Now, when we look at the discourses of the Buddha, we know that, this asking question has been very much in the Buddhist tradition. Like Digha Nikaya discourses, Digha Nikaya, when Rhys Davids translated into English, he named it Dialogues of the Buddha. Now, when we say something to be a dialogue of the Buddha, dialogue, Di means two, and then log means logos, talking, speech, speaking, conversation. So, dialogue basically means the discussion between two people. Now, whenever we say discussion between two people, is two people asking questions and responding. Okay? Now, this is basically different from, in many religions in the world, you don't have dialogues. What you have is what is called monologue. Mono means, one person. One person is talking, other people are listening, right? But then when you say dialogue, it is a back and forth discussion. Now, in this sort of discussions, we know in the Buddhist tradition, we have Buddha asking questions from the disciples. Now, usually we see in the many discourses, when the Buddha walks into the assembly hall, monks are engaged in some kind of discussion. And then Buddha asks, what is that discussion I interrupted by coming? And then they will tell you, okay, this is what we have been discussing. And according to the commentary, Buddha sometimes asks this question knowingly. Buddha knows exactly what is going on, but still he asks a question. Why? Because, when you ask a question and answer, that's a kind of more polite way to do that, rather than, intruding yourself. So in a civilized manner of, the talking, you ask basically a question and then you respond to. And in the Buddhist tradition, Buddha asks questions from many different perspectives, many different things in his mind. Attupattika, Pucchavasika, and so on. So sometimes, Buddha would ask a question in order to explain something. And then sometimes when a matter arises, accordingly Buddha would ask questions. Buddha would ask questions in order to explain something. So asking question is not something we need to learn from outside. Within the Buddhist tradition, we have quite a lot. I remember in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, in the last moment, Buddha says, if the monks have any problems about his teaching, to ask. Then, knowing it was the Buddha's last moment, monks keep silent. And then Buddha says, if you are not asking questions because of the sense of respect to me, you can ask through a friend if you don't want to ask me directly. Now you see, that shows how Buddha was keen, of course, in answering questions and, leaving his sasana, without leaving any question unanswered. Okay, so these are basically when we look at the question. So question is a very important thing. Now if you really look at the phenomenon called question, in the Buddhist philosophy we have real deep analysis. Now we know that there are 4 different types of questions mentioned in the discourses, right? Ekansa Vyakaraniya, Patipuccha Vyakaraniya, Vibhajya Vyakaraniya, and Tapaniya. So 4 kinds of questions. Ekansa Vyakaraniya questions are questions that you can answer directly. Ekansa Vyakaraniya question. You can simply give a type of yes and no answer. So that is called Ekansa Vyakaraniya questions. Now, Vibhajya Vyakaraniya questions are more complicated. Vibhajya means having analyzed. Before answering the question, you have to analyze the question. Now, what that means is, sometimes question can be misleading. Question can be having some more to be clarified within that. So therefore, you need to analyze the question. Now, with the simple example from our day-to-day life, somebody asks you to turn right to come to some place. But you have to know, turn right from which direction. Otherwise, how can you know whether to turn right or turn left? So you have to know the direction, which way you are coming, which way you are supposed to come, right? So that's a pretty simple thing. So Vibhajya Vyakaraniya means you analyze the question. You ask certain, the explanatory questions before that. So that is Vibhajya Vyakaraniya. And then Patipuccha Vyakaraniya means, you are asking questions by counter question. You are not really giving any affirmative or negative answer. You are just asking a counter question. Questioner asks something, then you ask another question, how would it be this? Your counter question can be the answer to the question. So you are not really giving affirmative answer to the question, but you are asking counter question. So asking the counter question is meant to show the real nature of the other person's question. You see? So both are questions, but one question is a question, other question is the answer. It doesn't come into my mind at the moment exactly an example, but of course, in the Dhamma you can find them. The last category is Tapaniya question, I think, which is philosophically very interesting. Tapaniya questions are the questions. Tapaniya means to be kept aside. You keep aside certain questions without answering them. Because now, basically in the Buddha's teaching, we have this category of Tapaniya questions. The reason given by the Buddha, this comes mainly in the Majjhima Nikaya, Chulamalunki Putta Sutta. He questions Buddha on this, what I call Dasa Avyakruta Vastu. Tang Jivang, Tang Sarirang, Anyang Jivang, Anyang Sarirang, whether the body and the soul are the same, whether the body and the soul are different. Antavaloko, Anantavaloko, whether the universe is finite or infinite, and so on. And Sasatoloko, Asasatoloko, whether the universe is everlasting or perishing. Then of course the 4 questions about the after-death existence of the Arahant. So these 10 questions Buddha kept aside. According to the discourse, Buddha asks why he did not answer these questions. Buddha says that answer to these questions will not lead to netang nibbidaya, na viragaya, na nirodhaya, na upasamaya, na abhijnaya, na sambodhaya, na nibbanaya sammatati. So you don't need to know answer to these questions because these questions would not lead to nirvana. So actually what the Buddha gives is only a pragmatic answer, no use. That's why Buddha kept aside. But if you look at some of these questions carefully, you can see that questions are wrong or improper in several different ways. In addition to they are useless. For example, if you take Tang Jivan, Tang Sarirang, Anyan Jivan, Anyan Sarirang, the question is whether the Jiva means Atma. Atma and the body are the same, or Atma and body are the different. Now, the moment you accept the question as a valid question, you are accepting the existence of Atma. Right? If I say something like, whether Atma is a blue or red, then, in the question itself, you have assumed the existence of something called Atma, right? Then you are asking what the color of that. Now, when you accept that question to answer, you are in trouble. Because if you don't accept in Atma, then how can you talk about it is color? If you don't accept existence of Atma, how can you talk about whether Atma are two different things? So you see, Buddha did not answer, not only because, these answers are not useful for the nirvana, but also, answers, the questions questions have certain assumptions. These assumptions are not good assumptions. The moment you accept that, you have been bought by the questioner. So, things like that. And then, of course, when you say antavaloko, anantavaloko, whether the universe is finite or infinite, those questions, go beyond your, the limit of knowledge. How can you really know whether the universe is finite or infinite? If you think that universe has a limit, border, then always the question is there, okay, what is beyond there? You can't imagine a big wall or something at the end of the universe. Then, always you are wondering, okay, what is beyond that? So, it's beyond simply, maybe universe doesn't have, it's not finite, or we can't talk about in those terms. So you see, now this classification of questions everybody knows. However, my emphasis today for you is very fact that there is analysis of questions. It's something very, very important philosophically. It shows a very advanced state of understanding. Now you remember in the Sanyutta Nikaya, Abhisamaya Sanyutta, I think this comes with the Moliya Pagguna. When the Moliya Pagguna asks, Ko Vijnana Harang Aharati? Buddha's response was, No Kallo Panho. What is that? No Kallo Panho. The question is not proper. Now there you see, Buddha doesn't try to answer. Before answering, there is a critique of the question. In other words, you don't just try to answer the question. First you formulate the question in a manner, acceptable manner. Again, like Tanjivan Tansariran question, if the Buddha went to answer the question, Ko Vijnana Aharang Aharati, then Buddha accepts the existence of some agent in addition to Vijnana who is partaking Vijnana Ahara. Now, the moment you accept somebody in addition to Vijnana who is partaking Vijnana Ahara, then you are in trouble. Because you accept in something like Atma, which is in addition to Vijnana. What we have is Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana. So if anything there other than that, then of course you are accepting something like Atma. So, I would consider the very idea of question, very classification of questions, questions about questions within the Buddhist tradition are very important, okay? Because the very awareness of the nature of questions is something you can be really looked at from the Buddhist point of view. Okay, so the questioning. So philosophical study can be, actually we can do a good study about questions, right? At the same time we can do, we can go on asking questions about the things we are studying. So questions, examination, analysis and investigation. Now, these are the different type of things. You remember Vibhanga. Now, Vibhanga is one text in Abhidhamma, but in addition to that, we have Vibhanga Arana Vibhanga, Uddesa Vibhanga, and so on. If you look at the Majjhima Nikaya, there is a whole Vagga, 10 chapters, 10 suttas on, Vibhanga, and Satya Vibhanga, so on and so forth. So this Vibhanga comes from Vibhaj, to break into pieces, to analyze. Again, you see this whole concept of Vibhanga. And then the Vibhanga discourses you find in the Majjhima Nikaya, you find in many other places. Now, what has the Buddha analyzed? So, analysis is again, something very interesting. Now, when we talk about modern Western philosophy, we have a branch called analytical philosophy. Analytical philosophy started in the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, last century, in universities like Cambridge in England, and then subsequently, it was accepted by other, wherever, what is called Anglo-American philosophy went. Now we are talking about the 19th century, just about little more than 100 years. Okay? But when the Buddha referred to Vibhanga, he was referring long time ago. Now when he talked about the Vivajja Vyakaraniya, in certain context, Buddha says, Ahang etta vibhajyavadi. In this context, on this problem, on this issue, I am an analyst. In the sense, you answer the question by analyzing. So the analytical philosophy is a fairly new development in the Western philosophy. This is not a criticism of Western philosophy. I am just comparing. But if you take the analytical tradition in Buddhism, in the discourses, in the Abhidhamma, you have really a very long, lasting tradition of analyzing. Okay? And so analyzing, examining, you examine something, and investigation. Now, one good example for these things is what we are studying Nagarjuna. In Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika, all the chapters are called Pariksha. Now, Pariksha can be either investigation or examination. Pariksha. Isn't it interesting when you look at Nagarjuna? Nagarjuna may have lived around the 1st century BC and 1st century CE, during that time. Again, a long time ago. For him to call his chapters Pariksha is again something very interesting and important. This very ancient philosopher, he is using the word Pariksha. So the Pariksha means, as I explained to you in my Nagarjuna discussions, Pariksha is not an exposition or giving some kind of detailed description about something. Pariksha is to examine. Of course, in order to examine, you have to have some content. Without any content, there is nothing for you to examine. So what Nagarjuna would do is, he does two things. He assumes that you have the knowledge about that subject. So you have the content in your mind. Nagarjuna is examining that. In addition to that, Nagarjuna gives the bare minimum information that he needs in order to examine. So in Nagarjuna's chapters, you don't find long descriptions about the things he discusses. He simply pariksha, investigates. So any kind of study we are doing in these lines, questioning, examination, analyzing, investigation, probing into something, all these things are ultimately what you are doing a philosophical study. Now, from this point of view, you can see that in the Buddhist tradition, there are so many examples of this genre of studies. Now, unfortunately, today in the Buddhist studies, lots of us, our the researchers do quite detailed explanatory studies. They want to describe. But description is needed, but description is not the only one. Okay? Exposition of some matter is needed, but that is not the only one. So you need to have analytical attitude towards what you are doing. So this applies to any subject you are studying. Okay? It can be a textual study, or it can be any kind of conceptual study. But this is the sort of attitude you have to adhere into. So on the one hand, we have this aspect. The other thing is we are looking for consistency, coherence, and logicality. Now, what are these things? Here we are looking for somewhat different considerations. We are looking for consistency. Now we are talking about consistency in the sense of consistency between the ideas. So simply consistency is you cannot have, logically speaking, proposition P and proposition not P together. Now that is not consistent, right? Because basically the idea is you can't have P if you have, and then if you say not P. Now you cannot have these things two together. P is not consistent with not P is not consistent with P. So in other words, you cannot have totally mutually denying two propositions together. So the consistency is consistency between ideas, consistency between statements. So those have to be not contradictory. Okay? So this is basically the idea that the ideas have to be consistent. Now this idea you can again and again come in when you read Nagarjuna, you can see that. And also in the discourses you can see that consistency. Your ideas, your statements have to be consistent with each other. Now if you take, say basically the idea of telling lies. Idea of telling a lie is, breaking the consistency between your behavior and what you say. You do something and then you say something different. So what you did then, what you say are two different things. They don't tally with each other. They are not consistent with each other. So in Musawada, in the act of telling lie, there is breaking of violation of consistency. Okay? So you are looking for the consistency between ideas. So that is one thing. And then we look at the coherence. Now coherence of the ideas means the internal consistency, or your ideas can be cohere with each other, means your ideas fit together to make a complete picture. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, right? We have pieces together and then we put together and we create a picture. Now what we did was you put the right things in the right place and then look, there is a picture there. So the coherence is, the internal consistency of the ideas as a whole. One good example from the discourses is when Buddha said about Mahapadesha in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. Mahapadesha means great indicators. Now Buddha had to give this idea of Mahapadesha, great indicator or great criterion. When he was close to Parinirvana, there was a question. how the disciples could know whether something was said by the Buddha or not. As we have today, what the Buddha said were not in the books. They were in people's mind. So Venerable Ananda, we know that memorized many things. But in addition to that, there were other disciples who memorized, who remembered what the Buddha said. And there were some disciples who knew very many of things Buddha said. The story of Venerable Purana, who came after the first Sanghayana, shows that, He said that he did not accept the first Sanghayana. He said, you must have done it very well, but I will bear in my mind as I have heard from the Buddha. So there were disciples like that. Now when the Buddha attained Parinirvana, the question was, if somebody comes and tells, okay, this was said by the Buddha, how do you know whether it was actually said by the Buddha or not? Because now Buddha is no more. Then the Buddha gave this criterion of Mahapadesha. Somebody could come and say, Buddha said this. And also that person could say, well, nobody else was there. I was the only person there when Buddha taught me this. Then what are you going to do? In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Buddha says that don't reject, don't accept. Just learn that idea very well, not rejecting, not accepting, just get the idea, and then Buddha says, Sutte otare tabbani vinaya sandasse tabbani. You have to put in the suttas and see whether this idea fits in. And vinaya sandasse tabbani, you put it in the vinaya and see whether it compares with the vinaya. Now actually, what is the principle behind this? What is the principle behind this? The principle behind this is coherence. Now, this particular statement brought in by a particular person, whether it is said by the Buddha or not, is you put in the Dhamma, if it fits with the Dhammas, that means if it is coherent with the other Dhammas, then you accept it as the word of the Buddha. Or you put this in the Vinaya, if it coheres with the Vinaya. If it fits with the Vinaya, then you accept it. So the criterion is coherence. Now actually when you try to understand the concept of coherence and consistency, coherence doesn't necessarily mean that something to be true. Okay? Coherence doesn't necessarily mean that something to be true. What it means is, whatever the statement is fits very well in the totality of the story. I will give you a negative example. Suppose somebody is telling a big lie. Okay? Now, how do you catch that person? Normally, when you lie, some of the things you say don't fit with other things, right? So then an intelligent person can hear it and say, look, what you said doesn't fit with what others, Like, you are contradicting yourself at some point. You say such and such a day, such and such a place, you are somewhere, and, you make a story. But that story, there can be certain things that are not fitting with that. But suppose you are a very good, competent liar, then you can create a very coherent story. But coherent story doesn't mean true, but that story is coherent. In the sense, it fits with everything. Whole story is, you can't reject it. So the coherence doesn't necessarily mean something to be true, but whether something is agreeable, fitting with the system. Now when the Buddha said that, Sutte otare tabbani, vinaya sandasse tabbani, what it means is that, you put it in the sutta, you put it in the vinaya. But of course, whether the sutta and vinaya are true, that's a different issue, But simply it means that they cohere with the entire picture. So when I say that consistency and coherence, we are not talking about whether something is true or false. What we are saying is whether what is said is not violating the principle of, we can say, principle of non-contradiction. That's one way to put that. Or whether it fits with the totality of the whole picture of something. So consistency and coherence are two very important criteria whenever we are trying to analyze some statements. So statements have to be consistent with each other. You remember in one place Buddha says, I think he says this to Satchaka. Buddha says something like, Na khote sandhiyati purimenava pachimang, pachimenava purimang. Na khote sandhiyati purimenava pachimang, pachimenava purimang. So the Buddha's observation is, he says to this person, what you said doesn't tally with what you said later. What you said later does not tally with what you said earlier. Now what is this? It's basically consistency. What you said earlier is not consistent with what you say now. What you say now is not consistent with what you said earlier. I mean, the two statements are contradictory to each other. Now, that doesn't talk about whether it is true or false, whether it is right or wrong. But this consideration is beyond that. You simply see, so these are really virtues of not only of the Dhamma, any kind of intelligible, good, proper discourse, the proper discussion has to have these qualities. What you say has to be consistent, what you say has to be coherent. Now, if the things are not consistent with each other, you write a paper or you write your dissertation. If your ideas are not coherent, then of course it's consistent with other ideas, it's problematic. If what you say in one chapter is not consistent with what you say in the other chapter, and then if you take the whole dissertation or article, paper, and then your paper is not coherent, then of course, so this coherence and consistency are really closely connected to concepts, but there is a difference. Through these criteria, consistency and coherence, we are looking at not only the discourses of the Buddha, any good writing has to have, these qualities. So when you are looking from these points of view, we can say that you are looking at this from a philosophical point of view, okay? Then finally I say logicality, something to be logical. Now this logicality can be described in two ways. One is a very general meaning of logic. When we talk about logic, logical, something to be logical or something to be not logical or illogical, what we mean is a general thing. A particular statement is not logical means not really, say, consistent, coherent, intelligent, doesn't make sense. We can say it is not logical. Now, that is the very general sense of logicality. So, if what we say is logical, that means it has a structure, proper structure, method, and so on. Second meaning of logicality is, when we say something is logical, it follows the logical rules. It follows the logical rules. Now, what are the logical rules? Now, we know Western logical rules. We also know Indian logical rules. So, logic can be, different systems. Now, basically today we are talking about the Western logical system. Now, in my Kathavattu discussion, I show you all the time that in the Kathavattu, the argument both by the Sakavadi and Paravadi is presented in both modus ponens and modus tollens method. So the modus ponens method, now P implies Q, P therefore Q type thing. Modus tollens, P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now, you can see that is not only Western logic. That you find in the Kathavattu also. So you can talk about having these basic logical rules followed in your thinking. So that is the more technical meaning when we talk about the logicality, okay? So we can use this term in a fairly general sense of being logical, and also we can talk about following the logical rules. Because there are certain rules, they are, we can say, in a way kind of universal. So in correct human thinking, you have to follow these rules. Now, two examples what I gave is modus ponens and modus tollens. And there are several more, but I don't want to spend time on those things today with you. But basically, when we are talking about this, we are talking about the logical rules, following the logical rules. Now, you see, there are two different things we looked at. In a philosophical study, we are looking at questions, examination, analysis, and investigation. Now, you can view Buddha's discourses, Buddhist philosophy from this point of view. And then the other thing is you can look at consistency, coherence, and, logicality, of this idea. Now, Buddha was very concerned about, this aspect in his teachings. You remember whenever Dhamma is referred to, we have a very popular statement in the discourses. About Dhamma, it is said, Adi Kalyanang, Majjhe Kalyanang, Paryosana Kalyanang. Right? Adi Kalyanang, Majjhe Kalyanang, Paryosana Kalyanang. Adi Kalyanang means good at the beginning, good at the middle, Majjhe Kalyanang, and Paryosana Kalyanang, good at the end. What does this mean? When you go to commentary, of course, there are many details. You say, Sila is Adi Kalyana, Samadhi is Majjhe Kalyana, Panya is Paryosana Kalyana. Okay, that is one way of describing. But I think it has another meaning. That other meaning is, something related to this. You make a statement, it is good at the beginning, good at the middle, and good at the end means you have a statement, logical, consistent, coherent from the beginning to the end. That is what is mean Adi Kalyanang, Majjhe Kalyanang, Paryosana Kalyanang. That is a virtue of. Now, this is given as the virtue of the Dhamma. Right? This is given as the virtue of the Dhamma. So, Dhamma is what the Buddha taught. Now, Dhamma is Adi Kalyanang means its beginning, middle, and the end. If you take the entire system of the Dhamma is coherent, logical, consistent. So, in Anguttara Nikaya, there is a very interesting statement in one of these discourses. It says something like, Sabbang subhasitang buddha vachanameva. Sabbang subhasitang buddha vachanameva. All the well-said things are the word of the Buddha. Subhasita. Sabbang subhasitang buddha vachanameva. Subhasita. Bhasita means what is said. Subhasita means what is well said. So this says that all the well said things are said by the Buddha. Now, of course, it can be interpreted in several different ways. Like in relation to the earlier question we discussed, Mahapadesa. If somebody comes and say, well, the Buddha said this, how do you know whether Buddha said it? If it is well said, then you can conclude that it is said by the Buddha. Okay? If it is well said, we can say that that was said by the Buddha. Everything well said. Now, how do you define well said? Well, of course, according to the teaching of the Buddha, what is well said is whatever that conduces attaining nirvana, whatever that conduces eradication of raga, dosa, moha. So, there is a way to define what well said means according to Buddhism. So, if you take that way, you can say, what is well said, this word of the Buddha. So, this Adi Kalyana, Majjhe Kalyana, Paryosana Kalyana, and also the concept of something being well said, all these things go together. So, although I am talking about the philosophical study of Buddhism, Now, when we look at this aspect, you can see that, we are talking about basically how these things have been discussed in the teaching of the Buddha. So, I am not introducing anything new here, but what I am introducing here is, what we have in the discourses of the Buddha. So, remember, when we are doing Buddhist studies, from this point of view, actually we are making a philosophical study. It doesn't matter what area of study you are doing. Whatever area of study you are doing, you can be incorporating, using these criteria, using these concepts to make sure that you are doing the right thing. In other words, what I am saying here is, in a way, we can say that to do Buddhist research, you get methodology also in the teaching of the Buddha. There is quite a lot on the methodology. We talk about the method. In my whole this series of discussions, I am talking to you about the method. So you can see, you can get an idea of the method to be used by looking at the discourses themselves and looking at what the Buddha says. So, doing this type of study is a philosophical study. This you can do even in a textual study or any other study. I would like to see whether you have any questions or comments or any the matters to be clarified. Yes, sir?
These are all philosophical study.
Well, I included it under philosophical study, but what I try to say is, although I call it philosophical study, this is really within the Buddhist tradition. But when I say philosophical study, anywhere in the world, when they talk about philosophical studies, they talk about these aspects. But then what I try to do with you now is to show that these are coming also from the discourses. Of course, there are many books and things written on these things in the English language and Western philosophical point of view. There are. But what I am trying to show you is this aspect, these methods, these concepts, and then particularly that four things are really what we do: questioning, investigating, examining. So, these concepts are there very much within the Buddhist tradition. That's what I am trying to explain.
So, according to traditions, we see the Buddha's teaching, and for example, as you say, Sufasita.
Subhasita, yeah.
And another, Swakato.
Swakato, yes.
So we accept the Buddha teachings as authenticity.
Yeah.
So it's not easy to apply this method, for example, question, examination, analysis.
Interesting.
But how we apply it as in
Well, actually, ultimately, we might not come up with the conclusion that what the Buddha said is not consistent. We might not. But, there are some modern studies raising that type of questions. In order to answer that type of modern studies, you must be able to analyze the teaching of the Buddha in these manners. The other thing, actually, your question is like, okay, Dhamma is Swakhata, right? So we assume that Dharma is well said. Now, it's kind of very interesting because if you take the Dhamma, what is meant by well said is, in Pali it says something like, Niyati takkarassa dukkha kiriyaya, dukkha santa kiriyaya. It leads the practitioner to the termination of suffering. Now, that is the idea. Now, the criterion to judge the teaching of the Buddha is the Dhamma leads to the termination of suffering. Now, that of course applicable to the Dhamma come practice. Otherwise, you really don't know. So I agree with you. There is always certain limitations. But as students of Buddhism, you can't really assume it. You have to really prove it yourself. Now that is why you need these things. I mean, we can't simply say that, like, okay, Dharma leads people to the Nirvana, so Dharma is Swakhata. But nobody will accept it. You have to demonstrate it. You have to show it, right? In order to show it, you have to do these things. That's the important thing. I mean, for us Buddhists. But of course, this take us to a little bit of Dhamma and philosophy discussion. But, if you take this Saddha and Panya, you remember my discussion on Saddha and Panya? We start with Saddha, but our Panya is, almost zero. But then ultimately, your Saddha goes down and Panya goes up. But then when you ultimately become an Arahant, you know three things for sure. What are those three things? That's why you don't need Saddha. That's why Arahant is called Asaddho. Arahant doesn't have Saddha. But then he knows three things. First thing is Samma Sambuddho Bhagava. Right? You know Samma Sambuddho Bhagava. What is the second one? Swakhato Dhammo. Third one is Supatipanno Sangho. Now, you know these three things for sure when you attain Arahanthood. Before that, you don't know. Now, what that means is ultimately your knowledge comes to completion when you really attain that level. So, Buddhist practice is like that. I mean, I agree with you, of course we assume it with, certain, basically, Dhamma is well said by the Buddha. But, in academic study, we are doing something different. Not that we are trying to disprove the Dhamma, but we are trying to prove the Dhamma in the acceptable methods, That's what we are trying to do. That's why we need to do. I mean, even if we are not doing academic studies, you can't start with blind Saddha. You can't start with Amulika Saddha, you have to have with Akaravati Saddha. But Akaravati Saddha means Dassana Mulika. Dassana, vision. It is the main thing. So, in the Buddhist tradition, although, as you said, we accept that Dhamma is Swakhata, but we have to be sure about it ourselves. Everybody has to be sure about within themselves. That's what Pacchattam Vedyatabbo Vinyam. Pardon me? Yeah.
We have a process in the China video, but we see those see.
Yeah.
Right. The first, yes, you are right. The first we must be Sabbudisa. After that, he or she will believe.
So our conviction is, of course, ultimately what everybody finds is that Dhamma is Swakhata. But that every individual has to discover by herself or himself, right? That's what it is. You can't take Dhamma is Swakhata by the other person. You have to know it by that's why, this. Okay, why don't you take a short 5-6 minutes break and then we will come back. Ethics, epistemology, logic, ontology, metaphysics, etc. Now, studying Buddhism from the perspective of different branches of Western philosophy, such as ethics. Now, when we talk about philosophy, we are referring to certain areas of philosophy. Say, for example, ethics. Ethics means a study of right and wrong and good and bad. Epistemology means theory of knowledge. Logic. Ontology means about the existence of things. Metaphysics means things beyond physics, or things usually do not come under our sensory perception. So that is one thing. So when we talk about studying Buddhism from the perspective of different the branches, and then the second is also connected to it, studying different philosophical aspects or areas of Buddhism, such as Buddhist ethics, Buddhist theory of knowledge, Buddhist philosophy of mind, Buddhist philosophy of individual and society, Buddhist philosophy of economics, Buddhist philosophy of consumption, etc., etc. Now, which means that when we say we are doing philosophical study of Buddhism, now this connects to very general approaches of philosophy. But when we talk about philosophy, we are talking about areas like, say, ethics, epistemology, and we can say ontology, we can say metaphysics, things like that. So these are, we can say branches of philosophy or aspects of philosophy. We study ethics, epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, things like that. And this is one way to do that. And then we can talk about, another way would be to talk about Buddhist ethics. We can talk about Buddhist epistemology, and then ontological questions from Buddhism, the existence from Buddhist perspective, like, what exists and what does not. That can be, and then we can talk about Buddhist metaphysics. We can say Buddhist theory of mind. And also we can talk about things like Buddhist, philosophy of economics and, various different things. Now, if you look at carefully, there is a distinction here. Now, one way to do a study of Buddhism philosophical will be to say we can look at Buddhism from the perspective of ethics. Now, the difference is there we first take the concept of ethics from Western philosophy. What does ethics means? What are the definitions given to ethics? So we take those aspects and then we try to study Buddhism from the perspective of ethics. So, in other words, we are trying to apply the concepts from ethics and then we study Buddhism. Now, same thing we can do epistemology of Buddhism, okay? And then ontology, about existence, whether God exists, what does exist and things like that. When we say metaphysics, of course, the word metaphysics has several different meanings. Today, it has a very broad meaning. People use the word metaphysics in order to refer to any particular phenomena. But another meaning of metaphysics is something that is not a part of our sensory experience. Now, if you look at from that point of view, in Buddhism we have things like Pubbē Nivāsa Anussati, Chutupapāta Jnana, Iddhivida, Dibbasota, and so on. Now, all these things in that sense can be included in metaphysics, right? Now, so looking at, the study of Buddhism from this point of view is, we can say, studied from, the metaphysics. So you can see different branches of philosophy are there. So these different branches of philosophy, we look at Buddhism, we perceive Buddhism by can this be activated? Okay. Okay, philosophy such as ethics, epistemology, logic, ontology, metaphysics. And we study different, apply these things to Buddhist studies, and we try to understand Buddhist studies from these perspectives. So that is one way to talk about ethics. What's going on here? Something. It goes there, so why doesn't it go there? No. Doing this. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So, number one category is using the Western philosophical categories. You study, and also we can put logic here. Logic also. Logic is of course not only Western, as you know, but Indian. But still, some of we can use logical rules in study. And the second aspect is, when you say Buddhist ethics, Buddhist epistemology, and Buddhist ontology, Buddhist metaphysics, Buddhist theory of mind, Buddhist philosophy of economics, and so on. Now, there what we do is, in fact, again, we look from the philosophical point of view, and then we try to get what is in the Buddhist tradition relevant to these things. Now, there we were using concepts from ethics to understand Buddhism. And then this is also fundamentally not different, but here what we say is we are talking about what can be considered from Buddhist ethics. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we are using the Western concept, but Western categories, but basically to talk about ethics, Buddhist ethics, is to isolate one aspect of Buddhism. Epistemology, one aspect of Buddhism. Why I mention this is basically when you look at the teaching of the Buddha, you know that Buddha never talked about ethics or epistemology or ontology or anything like that separately, right? Now, today when we do this compartmentalization, we study ethics separately. We study theory of knowledge separately. But did the Buddha teach like that? I mean, Buddha was not a university professor to talk about, these things to the students, But today what we have done is we are taking things from the Buddha's teaching and fit into these categories. So we take what is relevant to ethics from the discourses and we discuss only that aspect. Then we take what is relevant to epistemology and then we discuss epistemology. What is relevant to logic, we take from the Buddha's teaching and we discuss logic. So that is what we are doing today. In a way, someone can say that that is not right. Because Buddha never teach these things like that. Buddha taught everything in a particular context. Buddha start from, this Anupubbi Kata, Dana Kata, Sila Kata, Sagga Kata, then go on Sila, Samadhi, Panya. So Buddha doesn't really compartmentalize, okay, I'm going to talk to ethics today and epistemology tomorrow. No, it's nothing like that. But, these are limitations we are working with. So today in philosophical study, we can do these things. maybe we borrow certain categories from them, those aspects, and then we want to discuss what Buddhist ethics means. Now there when we say Buddhist ethics, we are not necessarily referring to categories given in the Western ethics. Maybe we can get them. Or we can simply say that Buddhist ethics does not accept these categories, so we can talk about different categories accepted in Buddhism. But then concept of ethics, anyway we are borrowing Western philosophical term used in a more general sense. Okay, the distinction between the two groups is here we are using the Western philosophical categories, what Western philosophy says about ethics, and from that perspective we study Buddhism. That's one thing we do. So, on the other hand, here in this category, what we do is we take whatever is relevant to ethics from the teaching of the Buddha, whatever is relevant to epistemology from the teaching of the Buddha, and then what does Buddhism say about being and not being, existence and non-existence, and metaphysics, and theory of mind. Theory of mind is also one important part of modern philosophy, and also it is very important in the Buddhist philosophy. Without getting anything from Western philosophy, you can talk about Buddhist theory of mind. But last one, when I say Buddhist philosophy of economics, now there I'm referring to something little bit different. There what we are talking is, of course Buddha was not an economist. But from the philosophy of the Buddha, you can formulate certain principles. You can get certain pieces of wisdom from the teaching of the Buddha that can be applicable to economics. Okay? So we can talk about the Buddhist economics or Buddhist philosophy of economics. Now there we are not talking about the particular principles of economics, but broader philosophical attitudes given in Buddhism about, say, things like economics. So we can talk about those things. Now, this is another way to look at it. So when we say Western philosophy, we do Western philosophical studies. We can look at from both these things. Now then I give you example K.N. Jayatileke's early Buddhist theory of knowledge. Now you can see that 1963, it is fairly old book now, 1963. But this remains a classic in modern philosophical studies of Buddhism. K.N. Jayatilleke did this early Buddhist theory of knowledge. Now it is very interesting, theory of knowledge. I want to say again, Buddha did not talk about only theory of knowledge isolatedly, theory of knowledge. But Buddha has spoken of many areas related to knowledge. Now, what is knowledge? What are the categories of knowledge? How you get knowledge? Nature of knowledge? Means of knowledge? Now, all these things have been discussed by Buddha, taught by the Buddha in many different contexts. Now, what K.N. Jayatilleke has done is, actually he analyzed the discourses in the Pali Nikayas, and then he got all those, most of the things that are relevant to the idea of knowledge that occur in the discourses. So he did a very, very comprehensive study, almost running into 500 printed pages, huge book. Now the interesting thing is, when you look at the K.N. Jayatileke's work, you can see that K.N. Jayatilleke takes basic ideas about theory of knowledge from Western philosophy. But then he is trying to understand the nature of Buddhist philosophy accordingly. So if you want to know how a philosophical study of Buddhism can be done, particularly in the field of theory of knowledge, the K.N. Jayatileke's work will be something very useful. There, he tries to prove that Buddhism accepts some kind of empiricism. Now, from my early discussion, you know that when we are talking about science, scientific knowledge, basically we are talking about empiricism. And in the Western tradition, I explained to you, this empiricism and rationalism, how these things evolved through a long time. So ultimately, empirical method, or what is called induction, became the scientific method. Before K.N. Jayatilleke, when scholars studied Buddhist philosophy, they were of the opinion that Buddha was a rationalist. They said, they held this view mainly because when you look at the Buddha's teachings, particularly discourses like Kalama Sutta, Vimansaka Sutta, and so on, you can see that there is a very strong element of rational element, and also rationalism in the sense, the knowledge deriving from, basically from mind, and also the development of mind. Now, many scholars understood those things to be ultimately relevant to rationalism. So they concluded that Buddha was a rationalist. Now, debate was between two things anyhow, whether Buddha is a rationalist or empiricist, because those were the two main ideas of sources of knowledge. Now, up to that point, the idea was Buddha was a rationalist. However, in this work, Early Buddhist Theory of Knowledge, K.N. Jayatilleke tried to establish that Buddha was not a rationalist, but he was an empiricist. Okay. Now that is one of the main contributions of K.N. Jayatileke's, the reconstruction of, the Buddhist philosophy. Now there was something very interesting in that. In K.N. Jayatileke's work, when he said that Buddha was an empiricist, there is a question. Now that question is, now if a Buddha is an empiricist, how can Buddhism talk about things like Pubbē Nivāsa Anussati Jnana, the knowledge of recollecting past birth, Chutupapāta Jnana, how beings are departing and born, departing from this world and born in the next place. And also Asavakkya Jnana, extinction of defilements. Now those things are not part of empiricism of science. Science doesn't talk about those things. And for scientific method, Pubbē Nivāsa Anussati Jnana, recollection of your past life. Past life is not scientific in the sense, science methodology cannot capture that. Right? So it is not part of science methodology. Now, when K.N. Jayatilleke said Buddhism is a kind of empiricism, one of the biggest challenges was for him to show that these things also included in the Buddhist empiricism. Now, those are some of the very interesting questions when you try to study Buddhism from the point of view of science or point of view of modern philosophy. These are some of the challenges. Now, this challenge, of course, he tried to overcome this challenge by showing that Pubbē Nivāsa, Chutupapāta, and all these knowledges are ultimately based on, could be developed only by a person who has his normal faculties. For example, you cannot have Dibba Chakku unless you have your ordinary eye. Dibba Chakku and Mansa Chakku. Mansa Chakku means the physical eye. If you don't have a physical eye, if you are a blind person, according to Buddhism, you can't develop Dibba Chakku Jnana. In the same manner, if you are a person with hearing difficulty, impaired hearing, then of course you cannot develop Dibba Sota. So, accordingly, K.N. Jayatilleke tried to show this extrasensory perception, or the knowledge that goes beyond ordinary perception, is, according to Buddhism, based on the sensory perception. Or in other words, if we call it extrasensory perception is an extension of sensory perception. If you don't have sensory perception, he showed that you cannot have extrasensory perception. Now, in that sense, you can say that Buddhist empiricism is different. Okay? So, interesting thing is, when you read K. and Jayatileke's work, you can see that on the one hand, he takes this idea, theory of knowledge, and associated things from Western philosophy. But he doesn't try to fit Buddhist philosophy into Western philosophy. Okay? He takes Buddhist philosophy as it is and tries to interpret Buddhist philosophy without dropping anything. Now, sometimes it could happen that you take Western philosophy, whatever is that doesn't go with Western philosophy, you reject, you drop. Now, some people could do that, but it is not what is happening here. He takes Buddhist philosophy and he shows that in certain respect, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist theory of knowledge goes beyond. In other words, there is always limits to applicability of any kind of things. Even when you do Western philosophy, there are certain limits for you to, that can be applicable. So you have to understand this correctly. When we say the philosophical study of Buddhism, it doesn't necessarily have to be in accordance with the Western philosophy. Okay. I will give you another example, which is very widespread example. It's about Buddhist psychology. Now, the word psychology is a new word, but analysis of mind found in Buddhism is not new, right? Although word psychology is a new thing, there is a deep analysis of Buddhism on mind. Now, in fact, we can say that Buddhism is the most psychological of all religions, right? Because Buddhism has such a vast psychological analysis, much more extensive than any other religion, Again, it is not a criticism, but, simply you can see there is a reason for that, why Buddhism is so much, concerned about the mind. So the Buddhist analysis of mind is already there. There's a deep analysis. Chitta, Mano, Vijnana. And then when it comes to Abhidhamma, all these Chitta, Cetasika, and, the analysis of Chitta, Cetasika, different traditions, analysis of Chitta and Cetasika in the Theravada tradition. So there is so much, we can say, psychology in Buddhism. So, in fact, someone can do a psychological study of Buddhism. Or someone can do a Buddhist psychology. There are so many people who have written on this subject. Now, the interesting thing is, psychology is a new term. Okay? So, in a way, you are borrowing the term from there. But then you are using Buddhist psychology. Okay? But then, what I am trying to tell you is, when you do a Buddhist analysis of mind, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the line of Western philosophy. Although, you get the concept from there. Okay? So, I remember, again, fairly old work by a Swiss psychologist, I think Rune Johansson, in 1966. 1960s, he did this study in Sri Lanka. He published it in England. It's a very interesting study. Let me get rid of this. His name is his author's name. His book is Psychology of Nirvana. In fact, this is not a very big book. This, not a very long book or anything. But I would say that this is one of the very, very interesting books I have read about this thing. His methodology is, he doesn't refer to Western psychology, basically. but he bases his discoveries only on the discourses. So he just uses Dīga Majjhima Sanyutta Anguttara and a couple of books from the Khuddaka Nikaya. That's all. Now, based on those things, he does a very interesting analysis of nirvana, purely based on the Pali discourses. Now, that is Buddhist psychology of nirvana. Now, of course, the title of the book comes from modern thinking, psychology of nirvana. But on the other hand, what it means is you can imagine, right? Psychology of nirvana. What is the state of mind when we call nirvana? What is the status of the mind of the person who has realized nirvana? Now that is what is meant by Buddhist psychology of nirvana. So it's a very interesting book. And then subsequently he wrote something called Buddhist dynamic psychology. Buddhist dynamic psychology, he tried to explain the Paticcasamuppada, the 12 links in dependent origination by Buddhist dynamic psychology. So you can see that there is so much work has been done by scholars from philosophical perspective in Buddhism. Okay, so still somebody can really question whether it is legitimate to do this kind of study and so on and so forth. But that depends on, because today we are living in a world where these academic disciplines come together. You cannot be isolationist, which is not a very good thing. But on the other hand, it is one thing to look at the Western philosophy, but it is another thing to get the categories or assumptions from Western philosophy. Without taking those things, you can do very good studies in the Buddhist philosophy in itself. Now, this is a good example. Without referring to any Western psychological thing, you can do a psychological study in Buddhism alone. When you do Abhidhamma study deeply, that also is, Buddhist psychology. K.N. Jayatillake's, the work, Buddhist epistemology. Epistemology is, although a concept in Western philosophy, now what is the Buddhist theory of knowledge? So he discusses many aspects and he establishes, as I said earlier, that Buddha is an empiricist. Okay. Now these are some of the things that you can do from like philosophical study of Buddhist studies. Okay. So important thing is in this kind of study, there is a little bit of the comparative nature. So you need to know something about Western philosophy and then take in some ideas, but then how to incorporate, if you want, these ideas, or simply basically taking the idea and then you do a Buddhist study. Okay, before proceeding, the next thing is we will move on to conceptual studies. But before moving into conceptual studies, I would like to see whether you have any questions or comments on this, and then if we have time, we will move into. Otherwise, we can have a discussion. So, do you have any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You mean psychology? Psychotherapy.
It's also a kind of good mind.
Yes.
So it's also related with the Buddhism.
Actually, like psychology, psychotherapy is also a modern concept, and also there is a widespread practice of psychotherapy today. But, it is a matter of, again, understanding Buddhism and what the Buddha did and what the Buddha said from this perspective. Now, when we talk about psychotherapy, it is a pretty much established theory and practice in the Western tradition, right? Now, what the Buddha did, we don't call psychotherapy. But if you look at carefully, there is quite a lot, we can interpret in that manner. Now, in the way, it depends on how we interpret it. Now, psychotherapy anticipates that you are psychologically not well, right? So, pardon me? What is it? Patachara? Yeah, that's right. So, yeah. There are so many similar stories. Patachara's story. Now, basically what it means is you are psychologically not well. Now, this being psychologically not well can be defined ultimately in a very deep psychological terms as having kilesas. Now, when you look at psychotherapy, Buddha has been compared to a physician. Sallakatto anuttaro. Sallakatto means surgeon, also physician. And Dhamma to be a medicine. Dhammosadha samang natti. There is no medicine like Dhamma. These metaphors are already there. It's only a matter of interpreting it. You see? Now, if you have good enough sense, when you look at these things, you can see that, look, although we don't describe it in that manner, what the Buddha did is, But on the other hand, we always have to make a limitation. Now, when we talk about modern psychotherapy, there are quite a lot of limits in that. But ultimately, in Buddhism, when you talk about who is the healthy person, ultimately the healthy person is an arahant. Right? But modern psychotherapy doesn't go towards arahant. But it goes basically in a very, ordinary manner to make one's day-to-day life possible. But that is what psychotherapy is trying to do. But if you take Patachara's story, you can see psychotherapy, counseling, and then also ultimately the eradication of entire psychological problem. Like the counseling means basically how the Buddha helped her to get rid of the grievance, right? And then you take the story of Kisagotami, who came with the dead body of her child. But do you think that Kisagotami did not know that child was dead? Well, Kisagotami, could very well know that child is dead. But what was the problem of Kisagotami? That can be the problem of any mother. She simply does not want to believe, accept that this child is dead. That's all. It's the problem is psychological problem. So everybody kind of ridiculed at her because, this crazy woman doesn't want to believe that her child is dead. Child is dead. But when she came to Buddha, Buddha took it very seriously. Buddha never laughed at it. Even to the extent Buddha said that I can cure. Now, that gives hope. Right? But Buddha knew that he cannot cure it. But, what he meant is something different. Ultimately, Buddha knew that he could cure it, but not to cure the child, but cure the mother, really. Because the child is dead and gone, you can't do anything about it. But then Buddha took it very seriously. Buddha said, yes, but you bring me some mustard. Now, when Buddha says some mustard means practically every house has some mustard. But then Buddha said, make sure that, you get it from somebody who hasn't, doesn't have anybody dead. Now, that is the trick. And the woman is now happy. Now she goes from house to house, bring mustard. And everybody says, they are willing to give mustard. But then the condition is that nobody dead, in his or her family. But then they say, sorry, there are more people dead than living. And finally, when she walks to the end of that road, she realizes what the Buddha said. Then she comes back to the Buddha, not with the dead body. She gets rid of the dead body and maybe buried it, and then comes to the Buddha. Now that part is counseling. Right? That part is counseling. So we can talk about counseling. And then, beyond that, of course, Kisagotami or Patachara would not stop at that. Finally, they become followers of the Buddha, they become bhikkhunis, and they attain arahanthood. Now, that, of course, can be considered as the ultimate psychotherapy. Now, the problem is this. when we use these concepts, sometimes, we are taking the concept from Western tradition. Not only that, we are also delimiting the Buddhist concept. That's wrong, because psychotherapy in the modern sense is a very ordinary affair. Of course, I'm not belittling it, like Shisho Pranix, and there are some serious psychological problems, modern psychotherapy is trying to cure. So there is quite a lot of work in there. But basically, when we look at the Buddhism, ultimately getting rid of all the defilement is the most healthy state of mind. So whenever you use the Buddhist philosophy for psychotherapy, we must be aware of this larger extent of Buddhist philosophy. The problem is sometimes when we take the concept from outside, then we limit it. And also, unless we really define it, it is not really right to say that Buddha did psychotherapy in the modern sense. No, Buddha did something more than that. But there is, even you take Satipatthana Sutta. Satipatthana Sutta has Soka Pariddavanam Samatikkamaya Dukkha Domanassanam Attangamaya. Now what is that? Soka Pariddava, Dukkha Domanassa. Those are things that anybody encounters in the day-to-day life. So Satipatthana is meant for those things also. But Satipatthana is, when ultimately Buddha says, Eka yano ayam bhikkave maggo, it refers to the nirvana. So it is applicable to nirvana, but even things beyond that. Soka Pariddava, Dukkha Domanas are pretty much day-to-day things. So, yeah. And so what I'm saying is, these concepts you can take from Western tradition, because it is highly developed today. But whenever we try to apply these things, we must really know what is the real nature of Buddhist philosophy. That's why I said when K.N. Jayatilleke, although he took this idea from Western tradition, he showed that, Buddhist empiricism is much wider. Okay, now somebody can say, look, then that is not empiricism. That's fine. It may not be the empiricism exactly meant by science, but this is something different. The scope is much wider. But we cannot reject what is in Buddhism simply because it is not found in any other thing. You understand the situation? You can't limit Buddhist psychotherapy, if you want to say that, simply because Western psychotherapy doesn't have it. I mean, our approach should be here, it is not that, Buddhism is better and Western philosophy is not good, or nothing like that. But we have to be objectively know the limitations, which is which. It's not because I don't think the right approach is, Buddha knew everything and Buddha had everything and, don't even, I say things the Buddha did long time ago. But that doesn't mean, to belittle Western tradition or anything like that. No. We have to have a right perspective about it. Okay. So, anything else? Yes, sir?
On the comparative study, Buddhism philosophy and political philosophy.
Anthropology and culture, Reverend, I have come in. So the next discussions I will be describing that, okay? So we will be discussing anthropology, culture and society in a more detailed manner. I will come to that.
So I wonder how do they go together? This means we said Buddhism philosophy and Western philosophy, and for one, is taught by the Buddha, and for one by the Western philosopher, and different destination.
Correct.
So how do you go together?
Important question. Well, there is always a limit to the comparison. There is always the limit to the comparison. I mean, the comparison doesn't go all the way through. No. Western philosophy originated in a different context, for different purpose. When we say Buddhist philosophy, actually we are talking about Buddhist philosophy today, but Buddha never came up with the philosophy differently, separately, and it's not like that. What the Buddha said, from what the Buddha said, we can derive these things. We can look at from the point of view. But what you said is very important because, there is always a limit. We can't really compare Western philosophy with Buddhist philosophy completely. Because there are certain connecting points, there are certain divergent points. I think we have to be aware of both. The problem is in the comparative studies, I will come to comparative studies later also, with that sometime, we try to get something and then we try to fit or fix, formulate the other thing according to that, which is wrong. So there are fundamental differences, but if you are aware of the differences and also if you are aware of the limits, then you can do a comparative study. Actually, doing comparative study, I will be talking more later. I will come to that, yeah. Okay, in the absence of any more questions, we will wind up for today. Tomorrow morning, we will be studying Nagarjuna. I'm going to discuss 2 new chapters. You will get copies of maybe tomorrow morning, sorry for that. And then tomorrow afternoon, we will be reading a couple of chapters from another text we selected. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.